Hey guys, in today's video, I'm going to be taking these drums and turning them into this. Okay, so the first thing I do is I gain stage these tracks because they are too loud. I'm just going to select all of these tracks here, all the drum tracks, and just scroll them down. I know it's going to be about -15, and that should give me some headroom there. And then the next thing I do is I go through and check the phase on the snare drum and on the overheads. I've got to put the snare drums in phase with each other. You can see right here, they are going in the opposite directions. So I'm going to select the bottom snare, and I'm going to get a trim plug in, and I'm going to invert the phase, and I'm going to render it. Now the snare drums are going in the same direction. I'm also just going to line up the bottom snare with the top snare, and then I have a group for that, and I'm going to align the snare drums with the overheads. The other thing I need to do though is make sure that the overheads are aligned with each other. I've already been through this process. I know it's close enough. So these are the overheads right here. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to align these snare drums. First, let's listen to what these snare drums sound like out of phase. This is out. Here's in. If you're listening on an iPhone, it's going to be hard to hear, but when they are in phase, there's a lot more body. Right now, the overheads are in phase together, but you can see the snare drums are not time aligned or phased aligned, whatever you want to call it. So right now they're not in phase. And so I'm just going to grab these and move them in phase. Line them up as best I can. So when I do that, there's more thump, there's more body to it, and so those are in phase. The other thing I'm going to do in this song is the tom bleed is terrible. If you look at these toms, the snare is bleeding into every tom. So I'm going to edit out all the snare drums out of the toms. I'm going to edit out everything that isn't a tom hit that's not meant to be there. So what I do to edit out the tom bleed is I will go through, I will solo the toms, and one by one, I'll just go through and cut out everything I know that's not meant to be there. And I'll put little crossfades. And then I also will have the overheads on like very low, just so I know where there's a tom hit, so I'm not cutting out all the stuff that I need. And this will really clean up a recording very fast. They just don't sound as good as I need them to, so they're going to be triggered, and I need a clean signal for the trigger to actually. So that's how I edit my toms. I do this as opposed to gating, especially when I'm going to trigger toms, which I normally do not do. So here are my edited toms. I've cut out all the bleed. You can see them here. And then we'll just add the overheads back in. So the next thing I started doing, because I know I'm going to have to trigger the snare, I'm going to trigger the kick, the toms. Basically, I'm just using the overheads. I'm going to still use the close mics on this drum sound. So once I edit all this stuff out and I get my session set up and I'm getting ready to mix, the next thing I'm going to do is start pulling in references. I'm going to still use the close mics on this drum sound, but it's mostly going to be triggered just because we're going for a heavy 2000s kind of Nickelback style. And this is what I've been referencing. Whatever you think of Nickelback, their drums sound good. So first I go in and I start picking out triggers. I have a ton of samples from Slate. These are what I started coming up with as far as samples go. I actually have like 3 snare drum samples going on. Just kind of a big gunshot thing. I've got the reverb going. When I start to mix these drums, what I do is I bring down all the faders and then I start bringing in kick and all that jazz. Once I have my samples picked out and everything. So here's your kick trigger. So it's just a big kind of an 80s drum sound almost. And then, so this was the snare that we had, which for this style of song, it's just not going to cut it. And there's the kick. And then I even went through and I found tom triggers. So this is what the drums sound like. So we'll go to the overheads first here. On this EQ here, on the overheads, I'm just scooping out about 5 dB at 470. I've got a high pass filter at 80. I'm boosting 180 on the overheads, and then I have a little bit of, it looks like 8K, boosting about 2.5 hertz there. And I'm also using the preamp here for some saturation. But normally I start with the kick drum. This is what the kick was, or this is what it was. So you can hear there's some bleed. I just got the Pro Q going in. I'm scooping out some resonance, a little bit of around almost 400 hertz. Then I've got the Neve EQ coming in. And I guess I'm adding a little bit of 470, and that one's off. And I'm adding 9 dB at 5. I'm just trying to get some click. And then I already was high pass filtering the kick, and then I have I have a gate on the kick, and I'm sending my trigger. I'm sending the triggered kick to the gate, so you can hear that it's getting rid of a lot of that snare drum bleed. And then I have a DBX 160 on my kick mic, and it's really doing not a lot, but when you compress the kick, and if you don't have a trigger, it brings up the level of all the bleed. So that kick trigger is pretty important. And then I'm sending the kick, the snare, all the samples to a drum cross bus. But here's the kick drum, the kick trigger, and I'm still using the original kick. It's just adding some of the body. So I never just fully replace the drums with triggers. I will blend in the original drums just to kind of keep that feel. Here is my snare drums. So we'll go over the snare. That's the top snare. I'm just getting rid of some of the boxiness and resonance on the top. I got the DBX 160 on it. It's not really doing much. And then I've got the Blackbird EQ, and there's not really anything going on there. And then I got the bottom snare here. And I do normally gate the snare, but it just didn't sound good doing that. So I'm definitely compressing the bottom snare. Here's my first snare trigger. Kind of trying to give it some tone. And then I called this the fat snare. And this just has one of the rock snares from Produce Like a Pro. I have a gun snare here. You have to work on the snare on the triggers because they can easily sound very machine gunny. And I'm compressing the tom triggers. Now I don't have the original toms blended in. They just weren't gonna cut it. So I'm just cutting off some of the lows on the rack tom and boosting a little bit right around 100, scooping out 220, and then I have these the low tom gated just because it was ringing out a little too much. I've got a Slate Digital Neve EQ on the tom. I'm boosting a lot, 13 at 110. I'm not being shy with it. 1.6, I'm boosting 7. And then I've got DBX 160s on everything. And so I sent everything to a drum bus here. And I've got an API 2500 on all the drums. And I got the channel strip here just to add a little bit of color. I'm doing some EQ. This is over the whole drum kit. This is where people talk about top-down mixing. I don't start there. I kind of use the drum bus. I'll get my compression going quick, like the API 2500. That usually gets on the drum bus pretty fast. And then from there, once I have the tone dialed in pretty well, if I need to add some more tone, like here, I'm adding 50 hertz on the overall drum bus. And then I'm even adding a little bit of 500 on the EQ, some 10K. If I turn it off, it's just kind of giving it a little bit of sparkle. I've got the high pass filter somewhere around like 25, and I'm using this input section here to get a little bit of API color. Here's without it. And I try to be careful not to just make things louder here. You can see here it's hitting pretty much at the same spot, but it's definitely it's giving it some vibe. And then I have my parallel compression here, which is just, I'm scooping out. I've got a high pass filter in the middle there, right at about 20 hertz, and then I'm scooping out some 57 just so it's not too boomy. Got the EQ set on dynamic for the low shelf, and then I'm scooping out 425 very wide, and all this is dynamic. I'm just trying to get rid of some of that boom. And then I have an 1176 from Universal Audio, all buttons in mode, fast attack, slow release. I'm just compressing the snot out of it. And then I blend that in with the rest of the drums. So that's without the compression. And then for the snare drum reverb, I've got the UAD plate set to full wet, and then I have the decay down a good bit, and there's no pre-delay. But the other thing I'm doing is I'm compressing the reverb with by the snare trigger. So that's just filling it out. But the main things that I did to make this drum kit sound what I think sounds good is I added a couple of triggers for the snare drum. I added one kick trigger, gated the actual kick mic, the close mic, and then I'm just kind of scooping out 500 hertz in a lot of spots. And yeah, so I triggered the kick and the snare and the toms just because it really needed it. I hate to trigger the toms, but it needed to happen for this song. And then parallel drum compression. And that's pretty much it. And just I've got a little bit of compression on the drum bus, and then a little bit of saturation from the API drum stuff going on. But that's pretty much it. One of my favorite things, even if you don't use drum triggers to mix, it's nice to have a triggered sound that you can use as a sidechain for your gates and whatnot. I like to sidechain reverbs. I like to sidechain compression on the reverbs, all that stuff. So that's pretty much what I did to mix this song. There's a couple of different tiers of drum sounds, and this is definitely one of them where obviously I had to replace most of the close mics with triggers, which I don't want to do. If the drums are recorded really well or they just sound great, if I don't have to use triggers, I don't. I just try to go with the natural sound and add little bits of color if it needs it. But if the drums already just sound great, then I don't really try to do a lot. Most of the time, I have to blend in samples with the actual drums. But for this, I had to replace all of it. So that is how I mix a poorly recorded drum set. The more mics you put on a kit, for me, I usually have 2 to 3 mics on the kick. I have a kick in, a kick out, maybe even a sub kick, snare top and bottom. And then 2 with the toms and the snare technique that I call Tony Two Fingers, that you put 2 fingers between the microphone on the snare and the actual snare drum. You do that for top and bottom, and they're the same distance from the snare drum. And then from there, the overheads, you just keep them the same distance from the floor. You can place them wherever you want over top of the drum set. And then you have a couple of room mics. So if you have 2 or 3, if you have a kick in, a kick out, that's really all you need is 2 mics in the kick. Kick in and kick out. You phase align those. You do top and bottom snare. You mic up all the toms, 2 overheads, and then 2 room mics. There you go. You can get a great drum sound just with that. But when all I have is like 1 kick mic, top and bottom snare, or just a top snare, It's really hard to get good sounding drums from home. So if you got any value out of this video, please hit the like and subscribe button. Also, there are free tracks for download in the description. I have competitions on this channel every month where you can win prizes. There are 6 sets of tracks you can download for free if you just click the link down below. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one.